The morning she arrived at Ashvale Park, the rain came sideways across the moors, and the coachman did not wait for her to lift her own trunk. He set it on the gravel, turned his horses, and was gone before she had raised her eyes to the house. Cecily Vane stood in the downpour, with one hand on the handle of the trunk and one hand holding her bonnet against the wind, and she did not move for a long moment because the house required a moment. Ashvale Park was grey stone and tall windows and a roof that seemed to press downward against the sky, and every window was dark, except one on the upper floor, which showed a single candle burning in a frame of rain-streaked glass. The drive was empty. No footman had come out to collect her. No housekeeper stood in the open doorway. She picked up the trunk herself and carried it to the front steps. She had heard what they said of Ashvale Park in the village. She had heard it in the parlor of the inn the night before when the landlord's wife had pressed a cup of tea into her hands and looked at her with something between pity and curiosity. She had heard it from the solicitor in London who arranged her placement, and from her own cousin, who had written 3 separate letters urging her not to go. "She is nothing more than the next one sent to be broken," her cousin had written. The position at Ashvale Park is not a position. It is a disposal. Cecily had folded that letter and placed it at the bottom of her trunk, beneath her second-best gown and her copy of Johnson's dictionary and the small oval miniature of her father, that she carried everywhere, its clasp worn smooth where she had pressed her thumb against it on difficult mornings. Her father had died the previous spring. The entail on his small Shropshire property had passed the house, and income to a male cousin she had never met, who was perfectly civil and entirely clear. She had 6 months. She had no mother, no brother. She had £114 and a thorough education in music, French, and the management of ledgers, which had been her father's genuine gift to her, and which she had used every day of her adult life at his side. She was 23 years old, and she had needed a position. The position at Ashvale Park was housekeeper, not a lady's companion, not a governess. A housekeeper which in any other house would have meant she was beneath her station, and which in this house meant she was the most recent in a succession of women hired to bring order to a household that had refused, for 2 years, to be ordered. The door opened before she reached it. A man stood in the doorway. Not a butler, not a footman. The man himself. She understood at once, though he was not wearing a coat. Only a dark waistcoat over a white shirt with the cuffs turned back, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not welcoming and not hostile, but something between them that she did not yet have a word for. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, features angular in the cold light, jaw set at an angle that suggested the setting had been maintained for some time without intention of changing. His eyes were a pale gray that looked in the dim doorway almost silver, and they moved from her face to the trunk she was carrying, and back to her face, without apparent embarrassment at the transit. "You are Miss Vane," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She carried her own trunk across his threshold. His name was Edmund Rowe, Viscount Ashvale, and by the time she had been in his house 4 days she understood 3 things. The first was that he was not cruel. The second was that he was not precisely kind. The third was that the household had not failed its previous housekeepers so much as the previous housekeepers had failed to understand what they were being asked to manage, which was not a house but a grief so large it had become a geography. The household had 7 remaining servants. It had once had 23, according to the account ledgers she found in the study. The 7 who remained were Mrs. Pollock, the cook, a woman of 60 who had been at Ashvale Park for 40 years, and who looked at Cecily on the first morning with the measuring expression of a woman who had seen several things tried and failed. Thomas, the groom, who was 17 and spoke mostly to horses. 2 housemaids named Dorcas and Ellen, who moved through the corridors in efficient silence. A footman called Garrett who had been hired 3 months previous and was still deciding whether to stay. An elderly gardener named Peel who came only on Tuesdays. Dintervals in the kitchen passage, and whom no one seemed able to account for entirely. "Who is the child?" Cecily asked Mrs. Pollock on the second morning. Mrs. Pollock did not stop cutting pastry. Lord Ashvale's ward, she said. His name is William. His mother was Lord Ashvale's cousin. She died in the winter of 1814. He has been here since. Cecily had seen the boy only at a distance at the end of the long corridor on the first floor. He had been standing still, watching her carry linens toward the linen room. And when she had looked up and met his eyes, he had not run, but he had not moved toward her either. He had simply watched with an expression that reminded her of something she had seen in animals who had been frightened enough times to have stopped expecting otherwise. She did not press toward him. She made a note of where he went and what hours he kept, and left his path unobstructed. On the fourth morning, she found the household accounts in a state of what she could only describe as creative despair. 3 of the previous housekeepers, she deduced from the handwriting changes, had made sincere attempts at organization. All 3 had abandoned them mid-quarter. The result was a ledger that read like a record of progressive demoralization, the entries growing shorter and less specific until they simply stopped. She sat at the desk in the housekeeper's room, which had clearly not been occupied in some time, and began from the beginning, going back 6 months, and reconstructing what she could from the delivery receipts and the cook's own careful informal tallies which Mrs. Brian Pollock kept in a small notebook, and surrendered to Cecily without comment. When asked, she was still working when Lord Ashvale appeared in the doorway. She had not heard him on the stairs. He moved quietly for a man of his size. He stood in the doorway and looked at the spread of papers and the open ledger and the 2 candles she had lit against the failing afternoon light, and he said nothing for long enough that she set down her pen and looked at him directly. The previous housekeepers, he said, found the accounts discouraging. I find them clarifying, she said. He looked at her. That same transit, eyes moving across her face as though reading something there that he had not expected to find. Clarifying, he repeated. The household spends more on coal than it needs to by approximately 1/3. The delivery arrangements in the village were set up for a household of 23 and have not been renegotiated since the staff reduced. The kitchen waste is twice what it ought to be, because the menus have not been adjusted to what can actually be prepared by a cook and 2 maids, rather than a cook and a kitchen staff of 6. These are not mysteries. They are arithmetic. He was quiet again for a moment. The previous housekeepers, he said, did not speak to me about arithmetic. Then that may account for some of the difficulty, she said, and picked up her pen. She heard him exhale. It was not quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, and it was the first sound she had heard from him that was not precisely controlled. He left without saying anything further. If you have stayed with this story this far, leave a word in the comments telling me what you think of Cecily. I believe you will understand her before the end. The dismissive label came first from the solicitor's letter, which she had not been meant to see, but which Mrs. Pollock had left on the kitchen table on Cecily's 5th morning. The letter confirmed her appointment at a salary of £30 per annum. The line that held her attention was a postscript in a different hand that read as follows. Lord Ashvale need not be concerned that this placement would hold any longer than the others. The agency provided a replacement within 30 days. She was simply the next one. She set the letter down on the table and stood looking at it for a moment. Then she refolded it, placed it back where she had found it, and went to speak to Thomas about the arrangement for coal deliveries from the village. She did not mention the letter to anyone. She kept it in her mind the way she kept all information that was useful, held precisely, without sentiment, available when needed. The boy William came to her. On the 7th day, she was in the library on the ground floor at the back of the house, dusting the upper shelves from a ladder, because neither housemaid was confident on one. She had finished the upper shelves and was reading the spine of a volume she had pulled down when she heard footsteps, and looked over her shoulder to find William standing at the threshold. He was, she saw now, up close, a serious-faced child, with dark hair that wanted cutting and careful brown eyes. He was wearing a coat that had been let out at the sleeves. He was looking at the book in her hand. That is a history of the campaign in Portugal, he said. Lord Ashvale's brother brought it back. She looked at the book in her hand. Then she looked at the boy. "Did he?" she said. "He is dead now," William said. "He died at Talavera." In 1809, she descended the ladder one rung at a time and returned the book to its place. "Were you fond of him?" she asked. William considered this. "He used to let me come to the stables," he said. Lord Ashvale does not come to the stables. She noted this. She also noted that the boy had crossed the threshold and was now standing inside the library, which she suspected he did not do often. "Are you hungry?" she asked. He looked at her with the wariness of a child who had learned that questions of this kind sometimes led to disappointment. "It is not yet dinner time," he said. "I know," she said. "I asked if you were hungry, not if it was dinner time." A small silence. "Yes," he said. She went to the kitchen and brought back bread and cold ham and a cup of milk, set them on the library table, and returned to the upper shelves. William sat and ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has not been made to feel self-conscious about being hungry. And when he had finished, he looked up at her and said, "You are not like the others." "Which others?" she asked. "The ones before," he said. "They cried." "When?" she asked. "After Lord Ashvale told them their work was insufficient," William said. "He says it in the same voice he says everything else, and they always cried." She came down from the ladder. "And you think I will not cry?" He thought about it seriously. "I think you will tell him he is wrong," he said. She considered this for a moment, because it was a precise and perceptive observation from a 9-year-old. "Perhaps," she said. She did not have occasion to tell him he was wrong until the 3rd week. By then she had renegotiated the coal arrangement with the village merchant, revised the kitchen menus with Mrs. Fitt. Pollock reduced the household's weekly expenditure by a measurable amount and reorganized the linen room, the plate cupboard, and the cellar inventory. She had also spoken to each of the 7 remaining servants and asked them what they needed that they were not getting. The answers were modest. Dorcas wanted a new apron. Hers had been mended past dignity. Ellen wanted the chimney in the upper corridors swept, as it had smoked in east winds for a year. Garrett wanted to know what his duties were, because no one had told him. Mrs. Struckhead. Pollock wanted a new copper pot, the largest having developed a crack that made it unsuitable for stocks. Thomas, with some difficulty, admitted that the groom's room above the stable needed a new window frame, the current one having warped. Cecily addressed each in sequence. She bought the apron. She arranged for the chimney to be swept. She gave Garrett a written list of his duties, which he read with visible relief. She requisitioned the copper pot from the household budget. She arranged for a carpenter from the village to assess the window frame. None of this cost more than she had saved on coal. Lord Ashvale noticed on a Tuesday when he found the household ledger on his desk with a summary sheet in Cecily's handwriting, showing the changes and their costs. He sent for her. She came to the study and stood before his desk with her hands folded at her waist, and met his eyes without apology. "You have been spending money," he said. "I have been spending approximately 40% of what I saved on the coal renegotiation," she said. "The net result is a reduction in weekly expenditure. The details are on the summary sheet." He looked at her. "I did not authorize the copper pot." "No," she said. "You also did not know the cook had been making do without a functional stock pot for 4 months, which has directly affected the quality of the kitchen's output. I authorized it. If you prefer I had not, I will note that preference for future reference." A pause. His jaw was set at that familiar angle, the one she had begun to read as the external marker of an internal conversation he was having at some speed. "The previous housekeepers," he said, "did not authorize expenditures without my approval. The previous housekeepers were not given sufficient information to understand what the household needed," she said. "I have been here 3 weeks. I have enough information now to make competent decisions about ordinary household expenditures. If you wish to review them after the fact, I will keep detailed records. If you wish to review them before, I will bring them first. Either arrangement is workable. I simply require to know which you prefer." He stared at her for a long moment. The candle between them caught the edge of his jaw. the line of his cheekbone, the pale intensity of his eyes. "You," he said finally, "are nothing like what the agency described." "The agency," she said, "described me as simply the next one." I read the postscript. He went very still. She did not look away. "I will review expenditures after the fact," he said, after a silence. "Keep the records." She nodded and left. She was 3 steps down the corridor when she heard from inside the closed study door the sound of something set down with a firmness that suggested feeling. She did not stop. She continued to the linen room, where she had a list of towels to inventory, and she did it, and she did not permit herself to consider what that sound had meant. She had been at Ashville Park for 6 weeks when the letter arrived from London. It was addressed to Lord Ashville from the firm of Hartley and Crane, and she knew from its weight and the firm's seal what it probably contained. She set it in a salver with the rest, and thought nothing more of it until the following afternoon, when Lord Ashville came to find her in the linen room. She was on her knees, sorting blankets, which was not a dignified position in which to receive a visit from the master of the house, and she stood, which she was able to do without haste because she had spent her adult life practicing composure on the floor of difficult moments. "He was holding the letter. The agency informs me," he said, "that they have a replacement available at 30 days' notice. They recommend I provide notice at once, as the house's reputation makes it difficult to find qualified candidates." She looked at him. "They say this every month," she said. "Did you know that he was quiet?" "I checked the correspondence archive," she said. "They have sent this letter, or a version of it, every month for 18 months. They sent it to your previous housekeepers as well. I believe they are suggesting, with some delicacy, that you are the difficulty, rather than the house." He looked at the letter in his hand. Then he looked at her. "And what is your assessment?" The question was careful, precise, asked with a restraint that she recognized as the cover for something that was not restrained at all. She thought for a moment about the right answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that Ashville Park is a house in which a very large grief has been allowed to set into the structure, like damp into stone, and that the previous housekeepers were women who were given no honest account of what they were being employed to manage. I think the agency is correct, that the difficulty is not with the house or with the position. I think they are incorrect in their implication that you are simply impossible. I think you are a man who has not had anyone in this house willing to tell you when you are wrong." The silence was long enough that she began to count her own heartbeats, an old habit from her father's sick room. "My brother died at Talavera," Lord Ashville said. "I know," she said. "William told me." Something moved in his face, a shift so small it might have been shadow if she had not been watching carefully. "My wife died the following winter," he said, "of a fever. I had gone to London to settle my brother's affairs, and I stayed a week longer than I should have." She did not speak. "The previous housekeepers," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. "She used to manage the household," he said. "Her name was Anne. She had a copper pot that she was very particular about. I do not know what happened to it." "It cracked," Cecily said. "I replaced it." He looked at her. His expression was not grief, exactly. It was the face of a man standing very close to something he had not looked at directly in a long time. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that I have made this house very difficult to be in." "Yes," she said. "I am aware," he said, "that you have not found it so." She considered this. "I have found it difficult," she said honestly. "I have found it exactly as difficult as the other things I have managed, and I have managed those." He set the letter down on the shelf beside him, among the folded blankets, as though he had forgotten he was holding it. She ought to have asked him to take it with him, as it was not a household document and did not belong in the linen room. She did not. She left it there. "If you are still in this house with Cecily tonight, stay until the end. She has not finished turning it. The change in the house was not sudden. It came the way spring comes in the north of England, which is to say imperceptibly, And then, all at once, and the first person to remark on it was William. He remarked on it by appearing at Cecily's side on a Saturday morning while she was directing the housemaids in the hanging of fresh curtains in the drawing room, a task that required a step-ladder and some negotiation with the curtain rods, which were original to the house and behaved accordingly. William stood and watched for a while, and then said without preamble, "Lord Ashvale came to dinner last night." She looked at him. "He lives here," she said. "He comes to dinner every night." "He came downstairs to dinner," William said. "He has been having it in his study for 7 months." She absorbed this. She had noticed the study dinners and had continued them without comment, as it had not been her place to rearrange them. "Did he speak to you?" she asked. William was quiet for a moment. "He asked about my lessons," he said. "I do not have a tutor at present. The last one left in March." She noted this with the same method she noted everything, precisely, without sentiment, available when needed. The curtains went up. The drawing room, which had been kept in Holland covers since the previous year, came back into itself. The fireplace, the chairs, the small pianoforte in the corner that had been beneath a cover so long, the keys had gone slightly yellow. She lifted the cover from the pianoforte herself on a Tuesday afternoon when no one was in the room. The instrument was a good one, a square piano of moderate size, out of tune, but not beyond repair. She played a single scale to assess it, and then sat with her hands in her lap. Her mother had played. Her father had listened from his chair by the fire every evening, without exception, until the illness had made it impossible. After he died, she had not played, because there had been no piano in any of the places she had subsequently lived, and she had not permitted herself to miss it. She played a short piece, a simple thing, not a performance, only a test of what the instrument could do, and whether it was worth the expense of a tuner from the village. She stopped because she heard footsteps in the doorway. Lord Ashvale was standing there with his hands behind his back, and an expression on his face that she did not have a category for. She had developed categories for most of his expressions by this point. The measuring look, the controlled disagreement, the constrained acknowledgement that she had been correct, the distant grief he carried in his jaw and his shoulders. This expression was not in any of those categories. "I beg your pardon," she said, and rose from the bench. "I should not have played without asking." "Anne played," he said. She stood very still. "Not that," he said. "Not that piece. A different one." She played. "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the piano. Not at her. And his face had the quality of a man who had opened a door he had not intended to open, and was now required to decide what to do about it. "I will arrange for a tuner," she said quietly. He looked at her then, and the look was not the measuring one, or the controlled disagreement, or any of the others. It was something more direct than those, a look that arrived without the usual distance and stayed. "Her name was Anne Thorpe before she married me," he said. "She was nobody's idea of a correct match. Her father was a country solicitor. My mother never entirely forgave me for it." Cecily did not speak. "She was," he said, and then he stopped and looked at the piano for a long moment, and then looked at Cecily again. "She was not unlike you in certain ways. Not in appearance, in manner." She understood that this was a very large thing for this man to say, and that he had not intended to say it when he walked into the room, and that the piano had opened the door. "I am sorry you lost her," she said. "I should like you to play again," he said. "If you are willing." She sat back down at the bench. She played for 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway for the first 5, and then came into the room and sat in the chair beside the fireplace, angled slightly toward the piano. She did not look at him because looking at him was not the point. She was acutely aware of where he was in the room, of the firelight on the edge of him, of the fact that for the first time since she had arrived at Ashvale Park, the house felt inhabited by more than one person's silence. The business from London arrived in the middle of November, and it arrived in the form of Lord Ashvale's cousin. His name was Gerald Rowe. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been required to doubt himself, and he arrived with 2 trunks and a valet. He treated Cecily on his first evening with the negligent courtesy of a man who had placed her in the correct mental category, at first glance, and saw no reason to revise it. "The housekeeper," he said when she came to tell him his room was prepared. "Edmund's 6th, is it? Or 7th? I have lost count." "I am not certain of the number," she said. "I rather think it is 7, he said pleasantly. "They do not tend to last. The house has a reputation. You will have heard it," he smiled. The smile of a man who meant nothing unkind. "A piece of advice. Do not let him bully you out of the position before you have earned your first quarter's salary. He takes a great deal of convincing that he is in the wrong." She looked at him with the calm she applied to all information designed to diminish her. She received it, assessed it, and set it where it belonged. "Thank you," she said. "Your room is the 3rd on the left," she told Mrs. Satter. Pollock that evening that they would need a proper dinner for 3. Mrs. Pollock looked at her, and then looked at the ceiling, and then looked back. "He comes every November, Mrs. Pollock said, and suggests to Lord Ashvale that the estate would benefit from professional management, meaning his own. He has been doing this for 4 years. "And Lord Ashvale's response?" "Cold," Mrs. Pollock said. "Correct. Nothing decided." Cecily thought about this as she made up the final preparations for dinner. The dinner itself was not difficult, because she did not attend it. Her place was to ensure the table was correctly set and the courses properly arranged and Garrett properly briefed. She went to her room and worked on the accounts. She could hear, distantly, the sound of conversation from the dining room, and she noted that Lord Ashvale's voice was lower and less frequent than his cousin's, which she had come to understand meant he was thinking more than he was revealing. Gerald Rowe remained for 3 days. On the second morning he found Cecily in the corridor and said with the same pleasant affability, "I have been speaking with the agency in London. They tell me the position has been quite unsatisfactory historically. I hope you do not take it personally. The house simply seems to defeat housekeepers. The position is satisfactory," she said. He looked mildly surprised. "Is it?" "The house is well managed," she said. "The household expenses are running below the previous year's figures. The staff is stable and competent. I do not find myself defeated." He studied her for a moment with an expression that had shifted slightly from affable to something more attentive. "Edmund speaks well of your management," he said, and she was not entirely certain he had intended to tell her that. "Lord Ashvale is generous," she said, and went to the kitchen. On the 3rd day he found her again, this time in the entrance hall, where she was arranging the calling cards on the salver. He was dressed for departure. His trunks were already in the entrance hall waiting for the carriage. "I am going to say something direct," he said. "You may take it as you like." She set down the cards. "Please, my cousin has not been well," he said. "Since Anne died, he has been, if I am honest, less than. Well, I say this because you are clearly not a stupid woman, and I think you know it already. There are people in this family who have an interest in the estate, not entirely unconnected to his state of mind." He paused. "I include myself in that number. I am not his enemy. I am also not disinterested." She looked at him carefully. "I understand," she said. "Good," he said. He picked up his hat and gloves. "You are the most competent person to hold this position in 2 years. I hope you do not let anything drive you from it." He settled the hat and looked at her for a moment over the brim. He needs someone who does not find him defeating. The carriage came. He left. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment in the quiet he left behind. Then she went to the study, knocked, entered when bid, placed the month's accounts on the desk, and sat in the chair across from him, without waiting to be invited, which she had not done before. He looked up from the fire with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was close to it. "The month's accounts," she said. He looked at them without touching them. "My cousin spoke to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "He is not a bad man," Lord Ashvale said. "He is a man who has decided what he wants and is waiting for circumstances to provide it. I do not hold it against him." "No," she said. "I did not think you did." It was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. Outside the study window, the November light was already failing, gray and horizontal across the moors. "I have been considering a tutor for William," he said. She had not expected this. She kept her face as it was. "Have you?" "He should have had 1 month ago," Lord Ashvale said. It came out with a flatness that she recognized as the voice he used when he was making an acknowledgement that cost him something. "I have not attended to it as I ought." "I can write to the agency in Leeds," she said. "They have a better register for tutors than Hartley and Crane, in my opinion." He looked at her. "You know the agency in Leeds?" "My father used them," she said. "He was particular about education." A pause. "What did your father do, Miss Vane?" She had not spoken of her father to him, though she had spoken of him to William and to Mrs. Pollock. "He was a land agent," she said, "for a small property in Shropshire, and then, when that property was sold, for a larger one in Herefordshire. He was very good at his work and educated you in it," Lord Ashvale said. "He educated me in everything he knew," she said. "He said it was the only thing he could give me that no entail could touch." The quiet that followed was different from the other quiets she had sat in with him. It was not the quiet of a man refusing to speak. It was the quiet of a man who was listening to something he had heard a long while ago and was hearing again differently. "I am going to say something direct," she said, which were his cousin's words, and she knew it and used them deliberately. He did not speak. "You have run through 6 housekeepers in 2 years," she said. "The agency has told you, in politely worded monthly letters, that the difficulty is yours. Your cousin comes every November and waits for you to become tired enough of your grief to let him take a hand in the estate. Your ward goes hungry between meals because no one has thought to tell the kitchen he should not. Your cook made do without a copper pot for 4 months because she did not wish to trouble you. Your groom slept in a cold room because the window frame had warped. These are not the difficulties of a house. They are the difficulties of a man managing his grief by letting the house go and calling it discipline." His jaw had gone very still. "I am not telling you this to rebuke you," she said. "I am telling you because I think you already know it, and I think you have been waiting for someone to say it plainly." He looked at her for a very long time. "You are," he said at last, "nothing like what the agency described." "I know," she said. "They described you," he said carefully, "as simply the next one." "Yes," she said. He stood up from his chair. She stood up from hers, and they were standing on opposite sides of the desk with the accounts and the candle and the firelight between them. And he was looking at her with an expression that was not in any of the categories she had built. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord," she said. "I should like," he said. And then he stopped, and she watched him choose the words with the care of a man who means what he is about to say and knows it cannot be unsaid. "I should like to ask you something that is not within the scope of your position." Her heartbeat was audible to her in the quiet. She kept her hands still at her sides. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to walk with me tomorrow morning. Not as housekeeper and employer. Simply as persons who have found, I think, that the other's company is not disagreeable." She thought of the letter at the bottom of her trunk, the worn clasp of her father's miniature, the £114, slightly less now, that she had come to Ashvale Park carrying. "I am willing," she said. They walked the following morning on the east grounds where the beech trees had shed their leaves, and the grass was iron cold beneath the pale November sun. He talked about his brother, which she had not expected. He talked about him with the careful specificity of a man who had not done so in a long time, and found the words still shaped exactly to their purpose, which was what happened when you kept a grief intact, preserved in silence, like something sealed in ice. His brother's name had been Philip. He had been 26 when he died at Talavera, the kind of man who laughed more easily than Edmund did, easier with people and with himself, who had, Lord Ashvale said, with a flatness that held more grief than any other register, made the house feel larger simply by being in it. She walked beside him and listened, and once when he stopped on the path and looked out across the moors with an expression she had not seen on him before, an expression that was neither controlled nor disciplined nor composed, she said, "He sounds as though he was loved." "He was," Lord Ashvale said. "By you," she said specifically. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "specifically." She had not meant anything by it beyond what she said, but the saying of it did something, cracked some small surface in his face, and he looked away across the moors for another moment, and then said, "Your father." "Yes," she said. "What was his name?" "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Vane." He was quiet for a moment. He must have been a very clear-sighted man. She thought of her father at his desk, teaching her to read a ledger, to understand a survey, to know what a fair arrangement looked like, not because he expected her to make them professionally, but because he wanted her to recognize an unfair one when it was offered to her. "He was," she said. They walked back in a companionable silence that was different from all the other silences in the house. She noted the difference the way she noted everything, precisely and without sentiment, and she kept it available. He asked her to walk with him again on Thursday. By December the house had changed enough that Mrs. Pollock remarked on it directly. Said, they were in the kitchen on a morning when snow had come overnight, and the room was warm with bread heat and the smell of a proper stock in the repaired copper pot. "He came to the kitchen yesterday, Mrs. Dare," Pollock said with the tone of a woman recording an event she wished to document accurately. "He has not come to the kitchen in 2 years." "What did he want?" Cecily asked. "He asked whether William had been eating properly, Mrs. Nepper." Pollock said he stood in that doorway and looked at the kitchen, and then he asked whether William was eating properly. "I told him yes, since you had adjusted the kitchen arrangement." She paused. He nodded and said it was good. Cecily poured herself a cup of tea and said nothing. "He also," Mrs. Pollock said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who was choosing her words, "asked whether you took your tea in the kitchen or in the housekeeper's room." Cecily set the cup down. "What did you tell him?" "I told him," Mrs. Pollock said, "that you take it here." "When the morning is cold," she looked at the cook. "Mrs. Sasses." Pollock was already turning back to her pastry with the manner of a woman who had said what she meant to say and had nothing to add. He came to the kitchen the following morning. Not for long. He stood in the doorway as he had apparently stood the morning before, and he looked at Cecily at the kitchen table with her cup of tea and her household notes, and she looked back at him. "Good morning, my lord," she said. "Good morning, Miss Vane," he said. He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot on the table, and sat down across from her, and she looked at him with the same composure she had maintained since the first morning she carried her own trunk across his threshold. "William wants to learn to ride," he said. "He has apparently been asking Thomas for some time." "I know," she said. "Thomas told me in October." He looked at her. "You did not mention it." "It was not my place to mention it," she said. "It was between William and you." He wrapped both hands around the cup. His hands were large, she had noticed. The hands of a man who had worked outside at some point in his life, not the soft hands of a purely domestic aristocracy. "I will speak to Thomas," he said. "William will be very pleased," she said. He looked at her with the expression still not in any of the categories. "I have written to the agency in Leeds," he said, "about a tutor." "Good," she said. "They have a candidate," he said, "a Mr. Hartley, no relation to the London firm, who has experience with boys of William's age. He can come after Christmas." "Excellent," she said. He was quiet again. Outside the kitchen window the snow was still on the ground, and the winter light came in pale and even, and the copper pot was on the fire. The bread smell was in the room. "Miss Vane," he said. She waited. "Cicely," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, the first time in the whole of the 2 months she had been in this house, and she was surprised to find that she had been waiting for it without being aware of doing so, because the name arrived with a specific quality of weight that she recognized. He had chosen the moment for it. She looked at him. "I'm not going to write to Hartley and Crane," he said, "to give notice for your replacement. She kept her face as it was. "No," she said. "I am going to write to them," he said, "to terminate the arrangement. If you are willing to continue in the position."
"I am willing,"
she said for the second time, using the same words she had used before, because they were still the right ones. He looked at her. Something in his face was quiet in a new way, not the quietness of control or of distance, but the quietness of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a long time. "The house is better," he said. "Whatever you have done to it, it is better." She thought of the copper pot and the new apron and the swept chimney, and the tutor from Leeds and William in the library eating bread and cold ham. She thought of the east grounds in the November light, and his hands around the teacup and the piano that had been out of tune and was now in the process of being corrected. "It is your house," she said. "I have only attended to what it needed." He looked at her across the kitchen table, and the look had all the specificity she had come to expect from him, precise and direct, and without the usual distances. "Cecily," he said again, because it seemed he wished to use the name now that he had been given permission. "I wish to speak to you about something that is not within the scope of your position." Again she set down her tea. "I wish to ask," he said, with the same careful weight he had given to the question on the east grounds in November, "whether you would be willing to remain at Ashvale Park not in the position of housekeeper." He paused. "I am asking you to understand what I mean by that. I am asking you to remain as its mistress, as my wife." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the pot on the fire. She could hear distantly Thomas in the stable yard speaking to one of the horses. She could hear the snow settling on the windowsill. "That is," she said, and very direct question. "I am aware," he said. "You told me once that you find clarity useful." She looked at the pale gray eyes, the set jaw, the face of a man who had set down a grief, and was looking at her from the other side of it. "Yes," she said. "I said I found it clarifying." "This is my attempt at clarity," he said. "I am asking whether you will marry me." Cecily. She thought about her father and his ledgers and the £114 and the letter at the bottom of her trunk. She thought about what it was to know a house down to its copper pots and its window frames, and its aching servants and its 9-year-old ward who had not been offered proper meals. She thought, "This is already mine, in every way that matters." "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached across the kitchen table, carefully, and set his hand over hers. He did not press. He was not a man who pressed. He simply placed his hand there, warm and still, and looked at her. "Edmund," she said, because it was his name and she had not used it, and it was time. His expression did something she had not seen before, something that cracked further open than the east grounds in November, something that was not entirely composed. He pressed her hand once, gently. And then he sat back and picked up his teacup and looked out the kitchen window at the snow. The letter to Hartley and Crane went out the following morning. The tutor from Leeds arrived in January, compact and sensible, and did not appear alarmed by William's seriousness, which was a good sign. The marriage was arranged for the spring. A vicar from the village, and a small party, Mrs. Seber. Pollock, Dorcas, Ellen, Garrett, Thomas, and William, who wore a coat that fitted him for the first time, dark blue and properly cut, and who stood very straight throughout the service with the expression of a child attending to something important. The announcement was made. Afterward, in the village, and in a brief letter to his cousin, who wrote back within a week in terms that were entirely civil and which conveyed, between the lines, something that was not precisely relief, but was adjacent to it. That evening, Cecily sat at the pianoforte, in the drawing-room, fully open now, the Holland covers gone, the furniture recovered, the chimney drawing properly, a fire built in the grate. Edmund sat in the chair beside the fire, angled slightly toward the piano, and William sat on the floor between them with a book he was reading by firelight, and outside the windows the spring had come to the moors, pale and tentative and real. She played the piece she had played on the afternoon he first heard her. A simple thing, not a performance, only the thing itself, in the house that was now hers. She looked at him once over the piano. He was watching her with an expression that was finally in the category she had been building towards since she stood on his drive in the rain with her trunk in her hand and her father's miniature at the bottom of it, and the agency's words in her ear, simply the next one. Not a category from any list she had made before. The fire crackled. William turned a page. Outside, the first true warmth of the year moved across the moors, unhurried and final, and the house at its back settled into a quiet that was not empty but full. The quiet of a place reclaimed from grief by the slow, patient work of hands that knew what was needed and did not stop. She played until the candles were low. Edmund did not ask her to stop. William fell asleep against the leg of the chair, and the night came in softly around all three of them, and the miniature of her father rested in her pocket, with its clasp worn smooth, and the house held them. Thank you for staying with Cecily until the end. If her patience moved you, leave a word below. I am glad you are here.